and welcome to this, the latest in our series of seminars organized by the International Institute for the Study of Cuba at the University of Buckingham. And this evening, we're really very pleased to be able to welcome a speaker from Cuba, Professor Ernesto Domínguez López, who is visiting us at the moment at the University of Buckingham, and has this afternoon delivered an amazing lecture to our postgraduate and undergraduate students on the missile crisis, and discussed at some length the implications and perhaps lessons that could be learned from that crisis in the context of the current global crisis that is occurring. So it's a really apposite moment to have someone from Cuba visiting a British university, and we're really honored and pleased to have Ernesto with us. Ernesto is from the Center for the Study of the Western Hemisphere and the United States in Havana, the University of Havana, Cuba. He's just recently been a visiting fellow at the University of Rostok in Germany, and he's come from there to the UK. He's spending a few days here in Buckingham with us, and next week he'll be giving some seminars and presentations at the University of Oxford. So we're really pleased to have Ernesto with us. He's a specialist in US-Cuba relations, and his latest research is in the area of US-Cuba relations since the turn of the century. So this is very current work that he's been doing, and he'll be presenting that to us tonight. So Ernesto will speak for about 40 minutes and take us through a slide presentation, I believe, and then there'll be time for questions and answers afterwards. You can use the chat function to ask questions during the chat, and we can come back to those at the end. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Ernesto and hand everything over to him. Over to you, Ernesto. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve, and great to be here. So far have been an excellent experience to me, and even better because I get to engage in these kind of conversations, which I actually love to do. And I see names that are familiar among those who are joining, and some of them have been to, some of them I know personally, and we have a good relationship. Some others have been to some of these lectures before, some of these conversations before. So I think it's really, really good to have this opportunity to engage in some talks, some conversation about topics that are important. And even so, I think that are even more important in the context in which the world is going through a huge crisis like the one that we are living currently in Ukraine. And all in this world in which we live, it is all connected, and we have to understand those connections to actually know, or at least to have an idea of how the work, how our future may look like, and even to understand how our present is actually evolving. Actually is. I'm gonna share my slides now. Give me a second to work with the technology. Okay. Here we are. So I'm gonna address essentially Cuba's relations in the 21st century that I consider to be, as the first part of the title says, is another moment in history. I'm using the expression "just another moment in history" just to say that it is part of a much longer, very complicated history. And as part of that, you cannot just separate the current events and say, "Oh, this happened because of whatever happened right now." You have to consider all that history back there. But also at the same time, that doesn't mean that the current state of affairs or the current situation is not very special in itself, given the specific circumstances in which we live. That I'm gonna touch a little bit on this. As most people that is here, this is the presentation is my presentation. My initial presentation is about these 4 different moments. I'm gonna be touching on history a little bit, but very quickly. Especially because most people, all people that I know that join this conversation, these people that know most of this, I'm just using this as a reminder of that fact. To me, is a fact the current events are but a part of a much longer process, very complex process, right? So let's go. As I was saying, there is a long history behind back there, which is based on a set of which has have been operating for a long time, and this is one of the most important factors, the fact that we have centuries of history. I'm talking about 400 years since the very beginning of first contacts between what is today United States, what is today actually was at the time also Cuba. It is a very multidimensional and complex relation that also is articulated around two different national projects that we have discussed in different moments in the past, which made this relationship that is conflictive in its own origin. And we also, probably everybody here knows and remembers, that there is a history back there of the elites in the US trying to acquire Cuba in one way or the other, from seizing it from Spain to buying the country, to buying the island from the US. They offer as much as up to $300 million in the 1800s, which was significant in many ways. And this have to do a lot with Cuba's geopolitical value for the US in first place, which at the same time, it made the US to be an important factor in Cuban history, both as this foreign power that have this interest in the country, but also as a place that was regarded by many Cubans as the source of modernity and a very important, potentially useful counterpart in this international system for different kinds of relations. The case of the sugar industry and the fact that the US was for a long time the most important market for Cuban sugar and at the same time the source of imports for Cuba it made that clear, but that also meant a high degree of dependence for a long time for Cuba. The geopolitical value of Cuba have shown these maps more than once, because I think it is a constant in all of this, and we cannot understand not the past, not the present, not even the future of U.S. policy towards Cuba and the bilateral relationship without remembering that Cuba has a very important, a very significant geopolitical value for the United States from every point of view, from the economic point of view, from the political point of view. The fact that in security terms, Cuba is relevant for the United States have been the case for centuries now, makes it even more important given that Cuba is in what we might call the first circuit of national security for the United States, especially when we consider that for a power like the United States, like the US, national security is not restricted to its citizens and its territory. It also includes its interests, which in this case imply the idea of keeping US first, building US as a global power, and in the current times, keeping the US in the dominant position in the international system, which is, by the way, I think, largely what is driving US projection in the current situation worldwide. The idea of his involvement in the crisis in Ukraine and all its conflict with Russia and China is largely driven by this goal of keeping the dominant position in the international system, and that has been the case for a while. And in that context, Cuba still plays a significant geopolitical role. This is why the U.S. policy towards Cuba is driven by geopolitics, also by ideology, not only socialism versus capitalism, which is part of the deal, or as they put it, socialism or communism versus democracy, which implies a very restricted, narrow definition of democracy, which is essentially liberal democracy in the American way. But also the idea that is behind what the United States is as the land of the free and all of that, at the same time, the idea that anything that have to do with curtailing the ability of the United States to project power is detrimental to their stance, and therefore is detrimental to their ability to project those, I would say, goals as the project themselves as the shining city on the hill and all of that. That is present as it is for Cuba. The idea, in the ideological sense, the fact that the U.S. is a very important, actually the biggest threat for Cuba's sovereignty and therefore for its continuity as a nation, as an independent nation, that is deeply embedded in the core of U.S. policies and therefore in the relationship itself, which is largely driven also by the specific interests of the different sectors of the American elites, and also on the Cuban side, the interests of governments in Cuba and of the people, which in the U.S. needs to include electoral politics, and the fact that the U.S. have been, both countries, but in the case of the U.S., have been building a narrative about Cuba that has very old roots. When we see the difference between the ways in which the two countries, for example, saw the Cuban Independence War, this is pretty much what is in the imagination of the Cuban people have been for a long time. The heroism of those who fought, the idea of the building the nation, the idea that Cuba made itself a nation among nations, etc., etc. Whereas on the American side, it was largely presented as Cuba, a weak country subject to the attacks of a foreign power bandit, in this case, presented like as Spain was presented, and the U.S. was the knight in shiny armor who came to help and save the Cuban people, which is presented as a woman who, you know, by late 1800s, when this cartoon was actually drawn, was a symbol of physical weakness and the need for protection. Very briefly, that that led to this narrative included was justification for the intervention in the Cuban Independence War, and then the building of a protectorate in Cuba with a number of military interventions. Later changed for the good neighbor policy, and the Cuban Revolution came to change all of that. It's a very, very short list of very important components of that historical process, including the hostility coming from the U.S., the Cuban reaction, Cuban foreign policy, American foreign policy in the context, and all these different attempts that were made in different moments to overthrow the Cuban government and the Cuban Revolution. At the same time, the most important pre-Obama attempt to change the relationship in a sense of re-engaging in negotiations and talks, which was led by President Jimmy Carter back in the late 1970s, which ended when, you know, the crisis between 1979 and 1980 and the ascension of Ronald Reagan to the presidency, which included all these policies coming from the U.S., include the formation of what is until today the very core of U.S. policy towards Cuba and the biggest problem for Cuba's development. And it's hard to argue against that, although there is a lot of people doing it, which is U.S. blockade. There is a lot of people even saying that this is not a blockade, just playing with the words embargo, blockade, which have different interpretations, different definitions. But the essence remains the fact that the U.S. created a system of sanctions that we call blockade and they call embargo, have been the biggest problem for the development of Cuba and a major force driving even political processes within the country, like, for example, eliminating any sort of legitimacy that that opposition groups may have, as long as they align with this kind of projection coming from the U.S. And of course, in the 1990s, all with the end of the Soviet Union, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, there was a new round of sanctions coming with the Torricelli Act and Helms-Burton Act that were very important, and they expanded and deepened the system of sanctions itself and the problem for Cuba, and effectively created the barrier for any executive that was willing to change the policy and engage in a more healthier relationship with Cuba, because these laws will be there to limit the ability of the executive in changing a form of foreign policy, a component of foreign policy, which we may argue that is unconstitutional. It's against the American Constitution when you look at the areas of policy that are the competence of each of the branches. But it also interfere with the ability of the courts to assign, especially the Helms-Burton Act, to assign or to determine, in the case of demands for reparations for property that was nationalized in Cuba that they consider stolen, which is highly debatable at the very least, and they limit the ability of the court to determine which is the value of that property, and therefore determine the possible compensation for that, which is in fact also against the Constitution, as it limits the capabilities of one or another branch of government or branch of power in the US. But all of this is just very quickly a very short synthesis, very short summary of a history that is there, and that essentially that is the situation that existed between the two countries when we entered the 21st century. This long history, conflict going on, the change in the international system that apparently made the survival of the Cuban government and the Cuban Revolution impossible. And that assessment of that situation led the U.S. to tighten the blockade in those years, in the 1990s, trying to push for a much quicker disappearance of collapse of the Cuban political regime, with this perspective of regime change in the country. And in the 2000s, when we entered the 21st century, we have a situation in which all of the different measures, all of the different policies were evidently not effective. They were not working in the sense in which the U.S. had used it, which was not just cost. And I remember having this conversation before with some people that I think is connected is here. The goal for all of these sanctions is actually not to cause harm to the Cuban people, though that's just a mean to an end. The end is regime change in Cuba. So they are not effective in that sense. That's why there have been a process of increasing and perfecting those tools. And this is also part of a broader change in U.S. foreign policy, in which U.S. have increased the use of economic sanctions. There is a recent report by the Department of the Treasury that showed that the use of economic sanctions as a tool in the United States by the U.S. government have increased 993%, or increased by 993% between 2000 and 2021. So what we can see in the recent years for Cuba, in the case of new sanctions, is part of much broader process in the U.S., in which U.S. foreign policy has gone down the path of increasingly using economic sanctions as a way to advance its interests, and especially to contain other actors when trying to separate themselves from any sort of from anything that the U.S. consider appropriate to their interest. And effectively, what that demonstrates is that the U.S. is no longer that appealing. I also remember having this conversation before, that appealing to others. So they require the use of more sort of hard power tools in that foreign policy. That is what Obama found when he came into office in the year 2009, actually January 2009. And what he did in those years, and this is, I think, is the starting point of a process of very rapid changes in some aspects. But there are some things that didn't change, and this is what I think that we need to concentrate on this point. Barack Obama changed a few things. The first of all, and this is especially since 2014, 2015, but he had made some initial, very modest but still relevant at the time advancements when he reverted some of George W. Bush latest sanctions or latest policies, for example, lifting some restriction for remittances, lifting some restriction for travels to Cuba by Cuban-Americans, and so on, that have been introduced by the Bush administration, and even ending some structures that have been created. Bush had created the Commission for the Transition to a Free Cuba, that evaluated and proposed policies to help to have a transition in Cuba, help between quotation marks, and from there he had advanced in that sense. But at the same time, but his biggest changes came since or after December the 17th, 2014, that everybody remembers that those speeches by both Obama and Raul Castro, and where they announced a few things, including the restoration of diplomatic relations, which are very, very important because it's a way in which both governments can have a presence in the other country's capital and can have a direct and formal line of communication. And also, when we have full diplomatic relations, these embassies can engage with other parts of society, both civil society and political society, in a legal way, whereas without that diplomatic representation, without full embassies, that wouldn't be exactly legal given the conditions within which the pre-existing interest offices operated. And he also included a general flexibilization or flexibilizations, very important flexibilizations in the existing blockade. His last two major decisions were to end the wet food, dry food policy, was the one that allowed Cuban immigrants to enter the United States when they made it to US soil without much problem, because they will go there and declare themselves to be political refugees, and they will be accepted in the United States, and then they will have access to the Cuban Adjustment Act, which requires for them to be about as a minimum of a year in the States, and ending also the Cuban-American Professional Parole Program that was meant specifically to attract Cuban medical professionals serving abroad as part of the medical cooperation programs that Cuba have been developing for years, and had a major tool, a major component both of Cuba's foreign policy, because it's a way to establish relationships with other countries at many different levels, and also a significant source of income in foreign currency for Cuba, because as part of those agreements, there are preferential prices and significant amounts of money come into Cuba and into an economy that needed and really needed badly. And these last two decisions were very significant, but they both happened in January 2017. That is just right after his presidency, just right before his presidency was ended. Why did Obama change his policy? There is a more general view in which he was, of course, adjusting his policy. We have discussed this also, but it have to do especially with politics within the United States, electoral politics and all of that. Very quickly, we have discussed this. If you want, we can go through this more in detail later. But when, I guess you know him, Trump came to office, things began to change, and he immediately passed, well, not immediately, but in about 6 months, less than 6 months, he was publishing this National Security Presidential Memorandum on strengthening the policy of the United States over Cuba, which he signed publicly at the Manhattan Theater in Miami, which was a symbolic gesture in itself. And then he unleashed a number of different early measures, early new political policy decisions. But in the second part of his tenure, which in this moment we can say this at the very least his first term, we don't know if we're going to have a new one. It is possible. There is some significant degree of probability. He increased, his administration increased hostility, and Trump himself, a significant representative, introduced or used an even more aggressive language. And they took the most newer tool they had, which is the use of targeted sanctions in the sense of blacklisting entities and individuals in Cuba, and they use it profusely. And even more so, it is important because the vast majority of the entities that were blacklisted, and this includes essentially state-owned companies in Cuba, some specific economic units of significant relevance, which includes all major touristic companies, include the financial companies, etc. Most of them, actually, the vast majority, were blacklisted in the midst of the pandemic. So from this perspective, we can say very immediately that the pandemic was used by the US government, in this case Trump's administration, to advance their agenda in the Cuban case, trying to show Cuba further and try to generate more problems for Cuba, probably looking for a collapse of the. I think they were looking for a collapse in the Cuban government that was already suffering. I mean, the Cuban population was already suffering due to the pandemic. There was already the huge economic crisis generated by the pandemic itself. For Cuba, that have to do with the collapse of tourism in first place, all the expenses that went to healthcare and to produce vaccines, which Cuba managed to produce homegrown vaccines. I guess everybody's aware of that. And in that context, attacking the Cuban economy directly was a clear attempt to make things worse and generate a degree of resentment in the Cuban population, trying to create then the conditions for a political change, a regime change in Cuba that will be presented as the legitimate complaints of the people, the legitimate reaction of a people that is suffering in that context. And of course, excluding from any sort of narrative the role played by US and its policies. And this is without even considering the fact that US have been supporting the opposition group within Cuba that were very important in promoting certain actions, especially in 2021. Actually, they have been doing that for a long time, but in 2021 they were very important in what happened. Why this happened? There's a lot of reasons we have discussed in other moments. But what is interesting to me is that the essential conditions within the United States, in the early times of this, it will seem that they didn't change much. But what did change was the group that was at that time in government, which means that in fact, you need to consider the different factors within their political system. You need to consider the conditions in Cuba, both economic and political, but you also need to consider the role played by the executive in setting the agenda in that sense, and the interest that executive represents at any given moment will also serve as a guide for the mobilization of sectors in society in support for one or another policy position, policy proposal in that context. And this is very clearly seen among the Cuban-Americans in Miami, more broadly in Florida, but especially in Miami, when you can see that during Obama, he actually managed to attract a lot of Cuban-Americans. A lot of them voted for Obama, but then Trump, he did that, and he changed a little bit the debate there, and there were increasing numbers of among the Cuban-Americans that supported the end of the blockade, at least when compared to prior times, and even more so the restoration of diplomatic relations, free travel to Cuba, free sending of remittances, etc., etc., etc. Whereas with Trump, with all his position, we have observed, and it is difficult to put some numbers in this other than the Cuba poll that the FIU does each 2-3 years. There are other sources are limited, but we can see how these trends seems to have changed during Trump, and we have then more people supporting the continuity of the blockade, less people supporting, fewer people supporting this reapproachment in other areas. So the position of the politicians the presidency of the executive, they are very important in mobilizing support, but even more important in guiding, in serving as cues for these sectors, these sectors of the Cuban-American community and outside this Cuban-American community regarding their political preferences in this sense. So, and we also have seen that all of this has translated into all these variations in the blockade. I shown this in a previous lecture, or at least one version of this, which is very interesting because this means that what we have here is a continuously changing system of sanctions that made things even more difficult for Cuba. And in that context, when Biden came to office with his look of grandpa, nice grandpa, and all of that, what he found was a very complicated situation, right? So we have a weaker position, U.S. weaker position in the international system. We have the fluidity of the relationship, the situation in Latin America, political conflict within the United States, the health crisis, the economic crisis that was going on, the social crisis that is becoming structural. Both economic and social crises are becoming structural. And what all of this amounts to an ongoing transition that isn't finished. And the problem is that Biden was the man that is in charge of at the moment to drive the country through this transition. And the problem is that requires sort of making decisions that are hard and will be hard fought no matter what. So it requires a very determined sort of leadership for the U.S. in that sense. And that seems to be lacking at this point. So what have Biden's administration done? Essentially keeping things as they were and even making them a little worse after July 11 last year, 2021. And I want to dedicate some time to July 11 because it have been discussed widely, but I think still not enough. Because all of them have been presented as a failure of the Cuban government, reaction of the people, and to the dire situation which they were, which especially the fact that people had grievances and authentic grievances. I mean, that's real. But at the same time, we can't forget that many of these grievances are at the very least made worse by U.S. Blockade, and then that they were highly instigated in this process by this massive propaganda campaigns against Cuba. And that works, among other things, because the Cuban government have entered in a process of increasing informatization of the Cuban society, providing increasing access to all internet platforms, including social media, which are fundamental as a way to generate these forms of tools for social engineering in Cuba. Put it in simple, it's social engineering trying to change people's attitude, people's behavior in this sense, modifying behavior in Cuba, and modifying it in the sense of creating more conflict. Because the problem is that it's insisting on the fractional lines to create conflict, insisting on the alleged inability of the Cuban government to provide for its people, insisting on the alleged culpability of the Cuban government or the incapacity to manage, for example, the pandemic, which, of course, if you look at the numbers, it is simply not true. Cuba have been successful in dealing with the pandemic. And then there is this additional campaign that anything that comes out of the government in terms of, for example, the result of its policies regarding the dealing with COVID pandemic is just a lie. So in that case, what we can see right now is that we have had a continuation of Trump-like policies. To some extent, it's not as frequent to have sanctions, although until late 2021, which is in his first year, Biden administration changed or added or changed the existing regulations against Cuba 7 times, meaning 7 new policy decisions modifying existing sanctions. And all of the modifications were to add new designations to the blacklist. And he added, the number is about little below 20 new designations, some of which are collective. For example, the whole special brigade of the Cuban National Revolutionary Police, which means that probably hundreds of thousands of people are included in that particular designation, although they are not named. So that's something that has been happening. And in fact, what have been happening is that the relationship between the two countries was stagnant or becoming a little bit worse during the first year of Biden's administration. There is still the possibility that Biden will go back to something closer to Obama's policy, but it's hard to believe or to project that he will do it at a significant level. What we have in this sense that is somewhat in the line will be the recent conversations, recent talks on migratory issues, which were probably likely triggered by the migratory crisis that have been going on for the last few months, which, by the way, is just part of a much bigger migratory crisis for the US, with the increased inflow of Latin American immigrants through the southern border of the United States. They have brought a lot of conflict with the region, a lot of different attempts to deal with that, and even programs, and et cetera. So it is important not to forget that everything that the Biden administration is doing have to be placed within the broader framework of the relations with the continent, with the region, which could not be understood without including Cuba as a significant actor, because Cuba is still kind of a pivotal part of the political differendum between the US and left-leaning forces in the region, have been the pivotal point in creating regional alliances, in interacting and promoting relationship with left-leaning forces in the region, from the late Hugo Chavez to the most recent developments all around. And even it made some kind of somewhat leftist forces to declare themselves one way or the other. I'm thinking about the cases of Peru and Chile, and the way in which the new presidents of those countries, they had to take positions, especially the Boric in Chile. He had to distance himself from Cuba and Venezuela as a way to win the presidency and not being seen as a radical leftist, which at the end meant that he was essentially assuming a more central political position. But at the end, everything that the Biden administration will do will be trying to achieve the same goal, which is regime change in Cuba as a way to rebuild U.S. power structure in the region, the power structure that the Cuban Revolution fractured, and a fracture that remains until today. And it's a very important component in all of this, the fact that the geopolitics of the region changed in 1959 and have remained at the very least different from what the U.S. would have wanted in this context. And for Cuba, that created a geopolitical environment that have been difficult, but at the same time have somewhat led Cuba to be active in the region and in the world. And right now, we have an additional problem. All of this so far is the history and the different factors and the pandemic going on and the effects of the pandemic and how they have made the situation far more complicated, the reactions by different American governments or US governments, their policies, and they have played with the different variables in the context. But then now we are in a situation in which Ukraine and the crisis in Ukraine became the center, at the very least, when we look at media and we look at political speech, have become the center of world affairs. The conflict in Ukraine, which has been oversimplified in most cases by most of those who speak about it, they either see, on the one hand, they see a full-fledged Russian aggression of Ukraine, unmotivated, and the attempt to build or rebuild the Russian Empire, etc. And on the other hand, Russia is just reacting to the threat that Ukraine represented and all the West and nothing else, and liberating people in Ukraine. That's pretty much the Russian position, or the fact that they want to disnazify and demilitarize Ukraine, that was a security threat for Russia. In that context, the crisis of Ukraine have brought additional problems for Cuba. One, in very clearly in economic terms, is a major problem, because that means that the world is entering a new stage in this structural crisis, and there is evidence all around. It is screaming at us that we are entering a new recession with prices going up, and at the same time, which means that it's not only a recession, it's actually a stagflation going on. Well, apparently that's what we are getting, which means that Cuba has even more problems with its economy. It made even worse by the fact that the war in Ukraine has made the Russian tourists, that were a significant part of the recovery of Cuban tourism, are no longer able to come or to go to Cuba. So the fact of the matter is that the war in Ukraine is affecting Cuba at many different levels in the economic sense. But then there is the other problem. Cuba has still, until today, has had for a long time a good relationship with Ukraine and a good relationship with Russia, and in this context, have been almost impossible for any government, any country around the world, to be neutral. And the Cuban position about it has been, and the Cuban official position actually is, we don't support the war. Cuba doesn't support the war. Cuba asks for peace and negotiation, but at the same time cannot support the resolutions in the United Nations that condemn Russia in the way in which they are written, that blame all on Russia because there are many other factors involved that are not included, and that is not nuanced enough as for Cuba to support it. And also they are not included, and there is a double standard, the very least double standard, because many actions, even worse than that of Russia in Ukraine, have been done. Many things have been done by, for example, the US, with the biggest promoter of this resolution, and others in countries all around the global south. And Cuba could not support that double standard. That's pretty much Cuba's position. So it means that in the political sense, Cuba have had to deal with that, and at the same time risking cooling its relationship out, or sometimes even harming directly relationship with Ukraine, who has a deep root. But at the same time, we have to consider that Russia and China are closer to Cuba, whereas the West is not. So it is a very, very complicated situation for the Cuban government and for Cuba in general. And they have brought also large, very important discussions in Cuba among the Cuban people regarding how to interpret Russia's action in Ukraine, and also how to interpret Cuba's government reaction to that, which is probably vastly more nuanced than you can see elsewhere, due to the impact it does have and the level of involvement that Cuban people have with both countries that are in this war at this moment. So what's next? Well, what's next? The problem is that actually, I will say that I don't know. It's not only because we never know exactly what's going to happen. The problem is that we are in a very uncertain world. If last time I did one of these talks, it was very difficult to predict what will happen, especially between Cuba and the US, except for the fact that it didn't seem likely that the US will change course and will engage in a Obama-like, or even more so, in going beyond that sort of policy. That remains essentially the same now, but then we have additional uncertainty because, in fact, if we see what is going on, and we see, for example, some hints that the US have been not approaching, but at the very least changing a little bit, a very little bit, its relation with Venezuela, which is, of course, also relevant for the case of Cuba and the regional geopolitics, there may be certain window of opportunity to have somewhat different sort of policies in that sense. Also, for the US in this context to have a regional crisis or worsen the existing conflict that are out there is not sensible. But then there is a question: is the leadership that is right now in the US in place capable of changing the policy to deal with that and try to do it in a nuanced, more flexible way? That is something that I'm not sure that is in the cards right now. So that's what I'm saying is what have increased in the last, and this is just for the last year, more than that, but especially the last few months, is the levels of uncertainty that we face. And that is pretty much what I had to present. And I'm looking forward having a conversation.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. There's plenty of what we call in English food for thought there. I was listening with great interest. It was pointed out to me that people's cameras and mics were not enabled. I've been through and I've enabled now, I think, everybody's camera and mic. So if you wish to intervene, I think it's now possible for you to unmute yourselves and to talk, and also switch your camera on if you wish. You can use the reactions and raise your hand electronically if you wish to ask a question. I would just like to make one or two starting questions, if I may take the opportunity as chair. Ernesto, I was very interested to listen to what you were saying at the end about the sort of tightrope diplomatically that Cuba is having to use at the moment in this conflict, over this conflict. However, my own sense is that there has been a consistency. I know that Cuba's, because of its position and the position that it's taken consistently in relation to United Nations, international law, etc., that it cannot condone or support the invasion, if you like, or the breach of sovereignty that is implied in the Russian position. However, of course, the Russian government has invoked precedent and UN resolutions, past resolutions and articles to justify in international law its intervention. And I would also say that Cuba has equally had a very consistent policy of being opposed to NATO expansion, which of course is a root cause of the present situation. And of course, Cuba, ipso facto, has consistently been a critic and victim of US imperialism. And there isn't a great deal, if you analyze closely what has happened in Ukraine in terms of its internal politics, and now what we understand to have been very serious US interference in the political process inside Ukraine, particularly in 2004 and again in 2014, which again has resulted in regime change. There does seem to be a pattern of behavior in terms of US foreign policy, which has been used, tried and tested in Latin America, not always been successful, as in the case of Cuba, Venezuela and Nicaragua recently, but regime change strategies, the organization of coups, the installation of governments that are compliant with US policies and interests. And it would appear to me anyway that there is a very strong case to be made that the crisis in Ukraine is in fact an engineered crisis brought about by US imperialism for the purpose of actually creating this conflict deliberately for much longer term interests. And so, in my view, there will be a point, I think, where Cuba will have to come off the fence and take a side. Do you agree?
Well, again, it's I do agree in the fact that the conflict in Ukraine, I don't know if it's entirely engineered in this process, but definitely the US policy towards Ukraine and towards Russia is a central factor in the development of this crisis and all that history, the Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Maidan, they call it the Maidan Revolution or something like that, 2014, are just two moments in a long-lasting policy, and which is in fact part of a much older position and projection towards Russia and the Soviet Union in the past, but it began even before the Soviet Union existed. I'm talking about the Western Journal, and US actually took the leadership in that sense during the Soviet Union years, and still is there, in which the Russia, Soviet Union, and Russia again wouldn't be seen as nothing else but a threat or an enemy, regardless of the political regime that they had at the time. So a very important part of all of this is that basic confrontation. In that sense, for Cuba hasn't and cannot support any sort of invasion. Simply cannot. That will be inconsistent with Cuba's history. It was being consistent with Cuba's political position and I will say principles, because sovereignty and the defense of the sovereignty of peoples, not only of states, but peoples and nations, is at the very core of Cuba's foreign policy, and because it is what Cuba claims for itself, right? The respect for its sovereignty. So Cuba simply cannot support an act that is against the sovereignty of a nation, of a country. Yeah, but at the same time, you are right that there is a number of factors there that, for the sake of consistency, is impossible for Cuba not to address. Like, for example, the role of the US, the role of imperialism in all of this. And Cuba have said in this context several times that one of the reasons why Cuba cannot support the sanctions and the resolution condemning Russia is that the role of imperialism in that conflict in particular is not addressed in any of those documents. It's not only the fact that prior actions by the US haven't been addressed in the same way. So there is a double standard, which I will say is more than two standards, actually several standards in this process, several of them. These multiple standards are not acceptable. That's part of the problem. But then there is this other part in which imperialism and all what this foreign policy of these people are there cannot be supported, should be included in any sort of resolution in this context. And also, it came again when Cuba voted against excluding Russia from the Human Rights Council. Cuba voted against, which is interesting because in the first vote in the General Assembly, Cuba abstained from voting, as did about several other countries. There were only 4 countries that voted against the resolution. Russia was one of them, and Latin America, Venezuela did it. Cuba abstained, like China, for example. So saying we are not supporting invasion, that's what it says. We are not supporting invasion. We just disagree with this kind of way to address it that is not consistent. So we will abstain from that. But in the second instance, the vote against the exclusion of Russia had to do with the fact that there was a prior moment in which the decision of excluding the country is made by a system that is less democratic than the process of including people. Requires more support, include someone in that council than exclude anyone, and that is at the same time excluding someone from that council will close a possibility of dialogue between different parts. All of that made the Cuba position, in that sense, more consistent with itself. I think that for the time being, Cuba's position will remain in that area. So it is openly against the war, okay, the active war, and calling for negotiations, a negotiated solution to the conflict. But at the same time, it's openly against the imperialistic and totally biased way of or perspective through which this has been presented to the world. And I need to call the attention about something. this idea that the entire world is, to say, condemning Russia is not exactly true. If we see that sanctions and all of that, yeah, are very important, but are coming from a number of countries that are very powerful, but are not the majority. Position and realities in the global south are very different, largely because the relationship between the global south and both the west and the east are a little bit different than the relationship between east and west. So the global south have a different perspective in spite of all the different forces that are driving this kind of reaction. So it's a little bit long what I said, but it's pretty much what I think this Cuba's position in this context and all of that will be.
Well, I mean, I don't want to kind of come back on that because the one or two things that you said that made that I could comment on. I've tried to enable everybody's camera and mic. I'm getting messages saying that it still don't work for some people. Let's just try. Gary, you've got your hand up. Do you want to see if you can unmute and speak?
Can you? I think you can hear me.
Yeah, it's
you.
working for you. That's great. Okay, Gary. I know who you are. Some people in the meeting won't know who you are, but if you don't mind, I'll introduce you. Gary is an emeritus professor in international relations and Latin American studies from Wisconsin, Madison. So really welcome to the chat.
Actually,
Gary.
Minnesota. Correct.
Minnesota. No, I beg your pardon. Minnesota.
Ernesto, I hope, are you going to be back in Havana for the CISEO conference at the first week in June?
Unfortunately, no. I will be in Germany until July, but I will participate online.
Well, okay, I will give you a very brief preview of what I'm doing at that conference, which is entirely focused on this topic. Basically, why has the Biden administration, after promising to do so in the campaign, along with the other 22 Democratic candidates, why are they not returning to the Obama policy? Be very quick. I wrote in Steve's journal several years ago, there were 4 primary reasons that the Obama administration moved. Total Latin American opposition to the US position, a changing dynamic in Florida, where Obama got half of the Cuban-American vote in 2008, a generally positive economic development of Cuba in light of its response to the economic reforms and the success of various initiatives, especially in international medical arenas, and the general worldview of the Obama administration that it, in a multipolar world, had to deal with its adversaries. I would argue that all 4 things have reversed themselves and can explain why the Biden administration has not returned to the new policy. This administration, while it contains entirely officials who were a part of the previous administration and agreed with the decision to open to Cuba in 2014, it's the same people. So one would have expected them to view the world the same, but they do not. And part of it comes from their leader. Biden is not Obama. Biden is from the Cold War generation. It's very easy for him to fall into the Cold War view. But it isn't just that. It's the way the world has evolved and changed over these last several years with the rise of China, with the clear oppositional position of the Russians, has contributed to what we are now into, which is basically a new Cold War and this democracy versus authoritarianism perspective, which is completely different from where Obama was. Politically in South Florida, the communities have changed there. Not so much. The Cuban-American vote went probably 55-45 for Trump in 2012, and then went to somewhere near 60-40 in 2020, but largely for reasons that don't necessarily have to do with Cuba policy, that have to do with other issues of the Republicans versus the Democrats. But the bottom line is the Democrats do not see a benefit in having an open policy on Cuba. Third, Latin America is generally nowhere near as united. Your key countries like Brazil, for example, being in the other camp, there's been not a united Latin American position in support of Cuba. A bit of it is developing around the Summit of the Americas. You probably know within the last 48 hours, the Bolivian president and the Mexican president will not be attending the summit in Los Angeles as long as the other three countries are not invited. But that is not a united position. And the conference in Los Angeles will go forward, and it will happen without Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And the fourth thing is U.S. policy in Cuba when it comes to openings to Cuba is when Cuba is in a strong position. Cuba is in its weakest position right now economically that it has been in 30 years. As you are well aware, the combination of the sanctions and the decision by Brazil to expel all of the doctors combined with the devastation of tourism by the pandemic means that Cuba is in a tough spot. And in Washington, that always yields emphasis among those in the policymaking community in Washington that now is finally the time that Cuba is going to collapse and be the ripe fruit that drops back into the hands of the United States. So that's my argument that I'm going to make at the conference in Cuba, that everything changed in a sense of the issues that propelled Obama to make what was, in my view, a very real change of approach toward Cuba.
You made some really good points, Gary. I would say, though, that Mexico, AMLO has declared that he won't be going to the conference.
Yeah. As I said, yes.
Yeah. And also he's made a deal to have medics from Cuba go to Mexico. He's made some very serious commitments. And I would also add that in the not too distant future, we could see Lula returning, and Lula in Brazil. And Lula has said that he's going to start a currency for South America, which will get rid of the petrodollar. So the situation may be pretty bad right now, but there are signs that they could improve. Ernesto, do you want to come in before I ask Al to?
One comment. That's what you were talking about, both changes in Latin America. That's what I touched on that on the presentation. I mentioned the fluidity of the situation in Latin America, because it's not like it reversed all the way to a more conservative, right-leaning system of governments fully aligned with the United States. Actually, they have been back and forth in this process. Remember, what I think is one of the best examples is that the coup in Bolivia, and then Mas coming back to government again, and how this AMLO in Mexico compensates to some extent for changes, for example, in Brazil, to some extent compensated a little bit from the right-leaning nature of the government in Brazil. So in many ways, a situation that is not clearly on one side or the other. But of course, that opens room for a number of different interpretations and a number of different decisions that could be made in terms of policy making. So that, of course, is not so clearly pushing the decision-making process in one direction. So then all the factors, like, for example, the general orientation, ideological and otherwise, of the administration, especially the leader of the executive, is very important in this context. By the way, it's not only about the Cold War mentality that obviously a person like Joe Biden have very deeply in him, but also the fact that he made an open commitment with democracy and promotion of democracy and human rights. And we know that democracy and human rights in that particular context is interpreted in a very specific and narrow way. And of course, everything that is different from that narrow interpretation is considered to be undemocratic, harmful for human rights, etc., etc., etc. So they will not, that was a problem from the very beginning, because it's sort of limits the ability of that administration to engage with foreign actors that just don't fit that very narrow mold. And those are factors that we need to consider in this context. And of course, there is also the pragmatic factors that may come at different moments that many of them we cannot foresee. So we cannot predict at this point how the economy will behave, or not even how the conflict in Ukraine will end, or even when, right? And all of that may change all of this in the future, and not so far in the future, maybe. But of course, that is what made the situation more uncertain in many terms, in many senses. So I don't see clear path, although the trend seems to be to increasing pressure and keeping the policy. And it's true, and Gary, I agree with you in the fact that every time Cuba is weak or is perceived as being weak, that triggers this trend to choke the country, to put more pressure so the regime in Cuba will finally collapse. That's what happened in the 1990s, actually. That's pretty much what happened in the 1990s. So we have not the same situation, but a different version of the same kind of reaction to the perceived or real weakness in the case of Cuba, even when there are some signs that we will survive this one in terms of the economic situation, social situation, and all of that, but still that perception of weakness is still there, pushing for or making people driving decision making in this context.
Okay, Al Campbell, who is deputy editor of our journal, or co-editor of our journal, I should say, the International Journal of Cuban Studies, is online. Hi, Al.
Hey, how are you? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, of course, after Ernesto makes a presentation, there isn't much more to add as to the details because he's covered them all. But I wanted to extend real briefly in two different ways. And two questions: why does the blockade matter? And also the generalization of the blockade as a weapon. So on the first one, why does the blockade matter? I mean, we always get this estimate every year from the Cuban government of the cost of the blockade, and it's huge. It's several percent of the GDP of Cuba every single year. But what I just want to really stress is that the blockade matters much, much more than that monetary value. Cuba, like all the third world countries, is in the process of trying to develop. And any small country, even a first world small country, has to trade extensively to develop. Production is through value chains, and only continental economies can have entire value chains inside the country. You've got to be able to sell your outputs and buy your inputs. You've got to be able to produce things efficiently. Cuba can produce certain things efficiently, like medical services. And of course, they're blockaded from being sold around the world. Tony Copcia, when he was talking about Russia and the Soviet Union in a talk in this same series last fall, pointed out that for 20 years, the blockade didn't really matter nearly as much from 70 to 90. And that's because Cuba was integrated into a bigger production bloc, a bigger economy. You can look at any small country in Europe that has a high standard of living, Belgium, the Netherlands, and they export and import 75% of their GDP. Cuba, before it had its present problems, was exporting maybe 15% of its GDP. It has to massively expand its trade if it's going to produce efficiently, which is the only way to raise its production. And of course, that's what Cubans are all talking about. So that's just the thing I wanted to stress, is that the blockade is much more than the monetary cost. In the 1980s, the United Nations listed Cuba as a industrializing country. It was really making progress because it was part of the big Comecon block of production, and it was developing industry. And as we know, by 1993, when it was forced to break, and that's even before the more severe sanctions that we have nowadays, industrial production dropped to 15%. That's what it means to cut trade, independent of why it's cut trade. And that's why the blockade is so important. And again, Switzerland, where I'm from, any country, If you put a blockade on it like Cuba, it would collapse. And so that's just one thing for both development and for efficiency, even of a first world country. Any small country has to trade, and that's why the blockade means so much. The other thing I'll be even briefer on, I just want to, Ernesto said, we can't know what's going to come, and that's for darn sure. The world's uncertain, and the United States is even more uncertain than the world. Some question whether the United States is really part of the world or not, but that's a separate question. But the thing is that we all know that for 4 or 5 years now, there's been a shift. I mean, even The Economist magazine, even the conservatives, the United States is stepping up the amount of sanctions and blockades that it's doing around the world. Ernesto referred to that in that study that I guess you said it was about 990% increase.
993% to be accurate.
993. Let's call it tenfold, so those of us that aren't quite so mathematical can get a hold of it. Tenfold increase from 2000 to 2020. And I mean, that really shows that it's exactly because the U.S. can't send in the Marines anymore that they've switched. This is their major tool of intervention in the third world, and it's going to be for the next 4 or 5 years. And now it's being tested on a bigger country than ever before. I mean, they used it on Iran, they used it on Venezuela, they used it on many smaller countries. Now it's being used on Russia, and massively with some really new sanctions. So the only point I want to end on there is we really have to watch what this means, because everybody who fights against international imperialism is going to pay more and more attention to sanctions as a major weapon. Before, sanctions were just something which was applied to Cuba, having to do with the weirdism of the United States and its obsession with Cuba. And everyone said it was wrong, but it wasn't a big thing. Now everybody who's against imperialism, the entire third world, is going to look on sanctions as the major weapon of aggression of imperialism. And that's going to make a big difference, the way the whole world looks on the sanctions against Cuba. I think that has to be watched.
Sure.
Great.
If I may comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Come in.
Just briefly, I totally agree that the blockade or the embargo, whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter how you call it, as long as you understand what it actually means. It is not only the problem of how much it costs in monetary terms, is that it is the biggest obstacle in Cuba's development. And even more so, the fact that the blockade itself, it is, it goes across all that happens in Cuba. Even things that are supposedly are not connected to the blockade. And people say, what the hell has to do with the blockade? They do have some level of impact. Corruption, for example, which is typically is supposed to be something that is endogenous of anywhere that you're speaking. The fact of the matter is that the blockade creates incentive, creates also opportunity, because, as for example, Cuba cannot just pay with bank transactions, with bank transfer, for instance, that Cuba buys. They have to send people abroad to buy with cash. So that means that it's creating the opportunity for those people to just steal that money. And it has happened. What is amazing is that it hasn't happened more than what it has. That's what is more interesting in the context. And it is also true that sanctions are becoming a weapon of use. I think I have used that expression recently in a couple presentation. It's a weapon of choice for the United States right now, because all the weapons are not working for the U.S. That's what it seems. I agree with that assessment. And interesting enough, it seems that they are not working very well in the Russian case either. I mean, latest figures have been seeing about not only about the ruble, but also about the income coming from selling, gas and oil and all the stuff. It seems that actually Europe is being harmed even worse than Russia in this particular context, which is putting all of that into question, at least to my eyes. Of course, the narrative in media is not reflecting that. You have to go and do a little bit of digging to find it. But all of this, what means is that eventually, and I think I saw some exchanges between Bob and Steve here, talking about China and everything that's happening right now, support for China. What is happening right now is that this international system is breaking apart into at least in two parts. So what we're seeing is the process of the emergence of the post-US hegemony type of international system. It will take time. It will be very painful, but it is ongoing. Not only because the decline of the US, but also with the specific actions by these major actors. And that is also will make that smaller actors like Cuba itself will find a different context, and then we'll have to make choices in that context. For the Cuban case, I think the choices are very clear. So there is no way we're going to join the US in this context. There is no way, at least not with this government, not with this regime in Cuba.
That's exactly the point I was trying to make, that eventually at some point, Cuba won't have a choice. They will be delineated as an enemy officially. I mean, they already are.
Yeah, we are. But I mean, we are officially an enemy.
Where will Cuba go? Cuba's not going to ally with the United States over this conflict. There's only one side it can pick, and if the United States makes that division, it will dictate where Cuba is allocated. It won't have a choice.
But I'm not talking exactly about political alignments. It's a little bit more than that, because that's
even economic. I mean, already Cuba is outside.
Yes, that's exactly the change the economic patterns in the world, and how these centers of and using world system analysis, these centers of the system are moving away from the West.
Yes.
So if I could just say one thing, I mean, the division of the world into two powers is going to help all the small countries, because it always gives more maneuvering room between them. It's not necessarily true that all of them need to tightly align with one side or another. Many countries can maneuver somewhat. Cuba has it a little bit harder because we know that the US is out to get them. But still, as the other countries in the world find new ways, new spaces because of these two options, that gives Cuba new abilities to link into. Other countries are going to develop new ways to get around. As long as the United States controlled everything, it was very hard to get around it. And as long as there's an alternative, then it'll open space for Cuba. That's all.
Sure. Absolutely, Al, I agree 100%. And actually, if you take, okay, let's just have a thought experiment and say, let's take the rhetoric of China in particular, but Russia also. They don't want to do it. They keep saying, if you just take their rhetoric as truth, they want to create a multipolar world. They don't want to create a bipolar world. They don't want a Cold War. They don't want a division. They want a multipolar world with respect for the sovereignty of all nations. I mean, they seem to be arguing for a return to a kind of ideal which never really existed, which was this international attempt to set up a system at the end of the Second World War. In fact, ironically, it would appear that they are arguing for a fairer world and so on. So, it seems to me that eventually this debate is going to open up. I mean, we've had a kind of, as Ernesto was saying, a full-blown Western propaganda offensive, which has delineated this conflict in a certain way and demonized Russia at the expense of actually looking at the reality and what the real landscape is. And eventually people will have to kind of step back and analyze this in a much more objective way. That's my feeling. And if you analyze it in an objective way, you can see the problem isn't really Russia, it's the United States. That's my view anyway.
There is a lot to discuss, just to put it there, because otherwise we're going to spend hours and hours just talking about that.
Well, you see what your discussion has provoked. Gary's put his hand up again. Gary, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd like to bring us back to US and Cuba.
Sure.
Okay.
I think we're really, the way to think of where we're at is this is much more the 2000, this is the Bush administration period. Think of it that way. but also think of it necessarily a reminder of the Bush administration period. Yes, the rhetoric and everything was there, but on various narrow issues, the Cuban government and the Bush administration cooperated on what the United States perceived were its national interests. And for example, during that time period, the migration agreement was honored by the Bush administration. And during that time period, the 20,000 per year was generally honored. And that created a stability on the Cuban side, right, of allowing the people that want to leave to get out of the country and go live in the United States where they would prefer to live. So I think that we have to hope that some of the pragmatism that existed on the US side during the Bush period, even though the rhetoric and everything was clearly into regime change, can be reestablished even in this difficult context. And that's why I do think that the renewal of the migration talks was one indicator of that, the fact that they're starting to restaff the embassy and potentially move toward a more of a normalization on some of those consular issues. Those things are positive. We're not going back to the wide open 2015-16 period, but I don't think we have to be entirely pessimistic about the fact that some things can be reestablished, because Marco Rubio is not running this policy. This isn't Marco Rubio's policy. In other words, it is being run by people in the White House who are not, congenitally disposed to hate Cuba, but rather to potentially work with Cuba on things they think are in the mutual national interests of the two countries.
If I could say something on that, Steve.
Yeah, go on, but go on.
Very short. I know we're running over. So I agree with everything he said. I think there is going to be a tendency towards trying to do some practical stuff, cutting across even some of the rhetoric he put out. The cautionary note that I would just say, those are very much in the moment sort of issues. The cautionary note is the big picture, which is compared to 2000, the United States is much weaker, and that makes it much more desperate in some ways. And compared to 2000, the US is much more politically gridlocked than it was in the year 2000. That makes it more difficult for some people that try to be pragmatic to get away with being pragmatic, unless they can stay below the radar. But those are just considerations within the frame that I agree with the points Gary made.
Ernesto?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to discuss here, but essentially, I think there is certain possibilities. There have been a practice, actually, that for most administrations have found certain points in which they can cooperate, the technical cooperation, certain security matters, for example, catastrophes, et cetera, that are there, and probably this administration will go. And again, the restoration of the migratory dialogues and recently showed that was certainly something that will probably happen. It's a sign in that sense. The probability that expands into a broader engagement, that is what I think that we agree, we agree, that is not likely at this point. It will take much more than that to advance in that direction. That's all.
Yeah, and I mean, I would be cautious about suggesting that the Bush, I mean, you're talking the George Bush Jr. administration in the early 2000s. I mean, they were extremely antagonistic towards Cuba and introduced all kinds of restrictions on remittances, visits by families. And of course, after the 9/11 attack, they placed Cuba on this axis of evil list. So this is Trump returned to that policy with the troika of tyranny concept, a very similar kind of rhetorical device. So I'm a little skeptical about seeing the Bush administration as being in any way cooperative in that sense at all, actually.
It's
and of
just,
course,
just some points. The point is, it's not cooperative, it's actually very aggressive. very,
very aggressive.
Just some points in which the Trump administration didn't even engage in those specific points. That's the difference between the two of them. But very aggressive. It was very aggressive, definitely.
And in the context of 9/11 and the aftermath and the war on terror, there was a moment in the early 2000s when there was a fear that there could actually have been an invasion of Cuba. So, I think that, you can't divorce the relationship entirely from the international aspects ever. Of course, during the Cold War, the major relationship and the stance of the United States vis-a-vis the Soviet Union had a particularly significant effect in Cuba. And, you can see again, at every stage where Cuba is sensitive, the relationship is sensitive to what the United States is doing elsewhere. Which is how I also kind of tend to think that the current, for want of a better word, gambit in Ukraine, if you talk about, and we are talking about, Brzezinski and the great chessboard here, and the term gambit is very useful because we are seeing a geopolitical great game, great power politics being reinserted into the international system. And I don't know if you agree with me, Ernesto, but this is therefore actually a return to a kind of 19th century international relations landscape, rather than the idea of a new Cold War is, I think, also a mistake, using the term new Cold War, because this confrontation, if it is a confrontation, let's say, between China and the US, China is in a much stronger position than the Soviet Union ever was. I mean, it's far more technologically advanced. It's competitive at a level of technology which the Soviet Union never was able to. Its economy is bigger, it's stronger, it has much greater reach in terms of its trading relationships than the Soviet Union ever had. It's competing with the US globally, in Latin America, its own backyard, in ways that the Soviet Union never could. Its population is massive, much bigger than the Soviet Union's was. So its potential and capability is far, far greater. This is a much greater existential threat to the United States than the Soviet Union ever was, because it is combining not just the nuclear capacity, but also the economic power. It's matching it in a way which is much, much keener, and it's much less vulnerable to what we call containment. I mean, US policy in the Cold War was containment. They were containing the Soviet Union. They cannot contain China. It's impossible. So the whole strategy is different now. And the idea about sanctions is very important. They can try sanctions on China, but hell will they work. They can try sanctions on Russia, but they won't work either, and they're not working. But they're also trying this new strategy of proxy war. So they won't engage directly with their own troops, but they will get a puppet state to do the fighting and supply them with the weapons. And incidentally, this is an interesting strategy, which is kind of new in a way. It's developed in a way to actually create a situation where they can slowly erode the economic power of these giants. I can't see how, if this conflict continues, how we're not going to see interesting developments elsewhere in the world as a consequence. And Cuba is going to be, whether it likes it or not, right in the firing line.
Oh yeah, unfortunately we'll be in the firing line one way or the other, whether we want it or not, whether we try to be there or not. We will be there. There is no other way. We are in the economic firing line, and we have been there for a long time. getting all the shots. Not we are not shooting at anyone in that sense. So,
but of course, I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I saw it was just something that occurred to me yesterday, because I was looking on Twitter, as one does, and somebody posted in the feed on my Twitter account, you know, somebody that I'm following posted this picture of the victory procession on May the 9th in Moscow, with this absolute sea of people parading down the street in the same way that those million people marched on May Day in Havana. Okay, and the footage of that was impressive. But you know, these people in Moscow were marching in exactly the same way, waving Russian flags and holding pictures of martyrs, you know, people who died in the Great Patriotic War, as they call it, the Second World War. And this immense march, and the comment in the Twitter feed was, and they think these people can be defeated by sanctions, ? And the same goes for Cuba. I mean, the solidity of the population in Cuba behind the revolutionary process is the key factor in knowing that whatever they throw, the Cubans will resist. And they've resisted for so long that it's very hard to imagine. And I think AMLO said it like yesterday as well, that he has great faith that the Cuban Revolution will survive whatever the Americans do.
well, another one. I'm not one of those who take things for granted, but at this point, I think the evidence indicates that Cuba has a significant degree of resilience in this context. I mean, being in Cuba and seeing some of the events of the last few years firsthand sort of gets you worried about many things, especially knowing that there's a significant portion of the population, especially among youngsters, that are very influenced by social media and all this hatred speech in social media. I've met students in college that are Trumpists, which is,
What?
to my mind, that's mind blowing.
In Cuba?
Oh yeah, they are. I'm not
Oh my
saying
God.
that it. I mean, to me, that's incredible. But there are. I mean, I cannot hide the fact that exists.
Do they call themselves Trumpistas?
No, I think they don't call it. They don't call it themselves. They call themselves like that. But they do say, "Oh, Trump was a good president, and I think he will be whatever." Just to say that puts you in a camp by itself. You know, in this context of taking sides, and they are very critical, not to say totally against the Cuban government. There are students like that. By the way, they do so publicly, and they are graduating from college. Not that they are imprisoned or expelled from the university. All those things that at some point, some of that happened. That's true, but that's not the case in Cuba, not for a long time at the very least. That is interesting as a reality. But at the same time, I see also that everything that happens, when you go on social media, you will think that everybody in Cuba is against the government. When you see social media, it's largely dominated by people who don't even live in Cuba. Many of them live elsewhere, and
Yeah.
they present themselves that they live in Cuba. But when you go to the street, you see, yes, this exists, but at the same time, there is people that have a totally different position and people that support the government, and you can see that. And talking about parades, May the 1st in Cuba, just in Havana, what about the estimate was 700,000 people. In this situation, with all the difficulties, yeah, this is a government-supported parade for sure. They help with transportation, etc., but nobody who went to the square, to the Revolution Square, was forced to go. Nobody. That's another myth that is out there. So that in itself is showing you that things are not as you will see in social media. So I do think that this resilience is there. It's really there. And it indicates that the revolution and the political regime in Cuba, which, by the way, I have nothing against using the term political regime, because every country has a political regime. That's not a bad word, in spite of the fact that it's used as a derogatory term quite often. It's just a concept. But it is still strongly supported by, at the very least, the majority of the population. How big is that majority? That is difficult to say. But otherwise, it wouldn't have survived this far. I mean, there is no way for us in a situation like Cuba's for a government to survive in absence of a significant, very significant degree of support by its population. Even people that criticize decisions, they in general support the process in the way they want to improve it. Some others don't. And some are trying to make their own, how we call it, to create their own file as dissidents, and then have a possibility many people leave the country. And you can analyze that from a political perspective, but it's far more complicated than that. So what it means is, it is certainly something that we can help but say, yes, it is resilient, and it seems that it will survive. But there is a lot of things that to consider in this process, and there is a lot of political decisions that should be made in different moments to adjust to the upcoming and constantly changing threats and challenges that Cuba is presented with. So, well, let's leave it there, because there's a lot of things for me.
Can you say
Gary,
what?
Gary wants to come in,
Sure.
Al.
Okay.
Sorry, he's got his
Sure,
hand
sure.
up. He's following the etiquette. Gary. He's gone again. Gary? Al, come on in.
I just wanted to say one thing, related to what Ernesto said. We really shouldn't be surprised that there's people in Cuba that say Trump is good. You know, partly it's the social media, but everywhere, every time, you know, after the Soviet Union collapsed, most of us in the West looked on Stalin as a pretty bad guy. 25% of the people, you know, thought he was pretty good. And one of the ways they did it, because he did some good things, was they denied all the bad things. There's significant layers, a few percent in Germany today, in the United States today, that think Adolf Hitler was a pretty good guy. And, you know, that's pretty hard for us to believe, that know the facts of what happened under Hitler's thing. But if you talk to them and say Hitler was bad because of this, they'll just tell you he didn't do that. That didn't happen. If you talked to those people about what Trump in Cuba, about why Trump is bad, most of them will tell you, no, he didn't really do that. That's what the 20% of the population in the United States that supports Trump says all the time. You try to say what he did wrong, they just say those are lies. He didn't do it. So I just want to say that it's not as surprising as you would think. The people that support these really bad people aren't necessarily bad in themselves. They're not supporting them because they believe they're bad. They're happy to see the devil walk the face of the earth. They deny that those are really bad people. That's dangerous. That's a huge political problem, but it's not to be unexpected.
I agree. That just happens.
Gary, you still have your hand up if you're there. Oh, taking it down. Well, it's 1848. Ernesto's done 5 hours of this today already, so I think it's time to kind of draw it to a close. I've got to say thanks very much. I thought the discussion was excellent, and the talk was superb, especially in provoking the discussion that followed, which I think has been really enlightening and helpful. So further announcements about seminars will be coming. If you said you wanted to be included on the mailing list, I shall include you, and you will be receiving the newsletters from the International Institute for the Study of Cuba in future. We haven't made any arrangements for seminars in the summer, but we will be working on producing a conference which will take place at the University of Buckingham in October on the 60th anniversary of the October crisis, as it's called in Cuba, the missile crisis, as it is called in the United States, and the Caribbean crisis, as it is called in Russia. So on the October missile Caribbean crisis, we will be having a full-blown conference with speakers from Cuba and United States, and hopefully from the former Soviet Union, if we can arrange it. In the present circumstances, that is rather difficult, but we will see. But look out for that, and notifications will be sent out. We do need to raise money for this in order to finance it. So if you know any benefactors who would like to be associated with having supported such a conference, somebody with a deep pocket, or if you've got a pocket yourself and you want to help, you can donate to our efforts. And I'll be sending out afterwards an email with the link to the recording of this session and a kind of begging bowl message as well. So forgive me for that, but we do rely on your donations for our ability to continue with this work. So just to say thanks again, Ernesto. Thanks again, Al, for coming, Gary, and everyone else who attended. And we'll see you next time. Stand by for more news in the emails. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.